Today it's my pleasure to introduce to you Jeremy Kohlitz. He's one of our newest members of the Rising Stars. Jeremy will be giving his first speech today as a Rising Star. However, he'll be doing project number 3 out of the Competent Communicator Manual, not project number 1. Today, so as part of project number 3, today Jeremy's goals are to select a speech topic and determine its general and specific purpose, organize the speech in a manner that best achieves those purposes, ensure the beginning, body, and conclusion reinforce the purposes, project sincerity, conviction, and control any nervousness you may feel, strive to not use notes, and his personal goals include getting comfortable speaking in front of an audience, finishing within the time limits, and having a dearth of verbal fillers. This is a 5 to 7 minute speech with the green light at 5, yellow at 6, red at 7. So Jeremy is a graduate of the University of Michigan, where he earned a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. And as we all know, there's a dearth of clean water in many parts of the world. So he also has a master's degree in water and waste engineering from, correct me if I pronounce this wrong, Loughborough University, which is in the United Kingdom. So that degree, I'm sure, influenced the content of his speech today, which is titled, How Toilets Will Save the World. Help me welcome Jeremy Kohlitz.
Traditionally, the first speech that one gives at Toastmasters is to talk about themselves. But anyone that knows me knows that I hate talking about myself. So I'm going to be talking about something else that I know well today, and that's sanitation. Yes, at the risk of being known as the toilet guy for the rest of my Toastmasters days, I'm going to be talking about toilets. I researched them quite a bit while I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Fiji, and I learned a lot about their importance. What I hope to convince you of today is that toilets can save the world, and there's something that you can do to help. Back in 2007, the British Medical Journal polled over 10,000 of its readers on what they thought was the most important medical advance since 1840. Nominations came in, there was plenty of deliberation, and after 10 days of voting, a winner emerged. And what the people and the experts selected, it wasn't antibiotics, it wasn't anesthesia, and it wasn't any kind of vaccine. What the people decided was the most important medical advance since 1840 was the development of the modern sanitation system. Today, 2.5 billion people do not have access to basic sanitation. That's 36% of the world's population. And 1.1 billion people don't have a toilet at all. That means they have to openly defecate wherever they can find a convenient place to do so. There's a dearth of adequate sanitation in the world. The consequences of this are staggering. Every year, 1.4 million children die due to diarrhea, and inadequate sanitation is one of the main contributors. Diarrhea. It's the stupidest thing. Something that's a joke here in the United States is the second leading killer of children in developing countries. And the consequences don't end there, rather they add up. Repeated exposure to incidences of diarrhea causes malnutrition in children, which stunts their mental and physical growth and makes them more susceptible to other diseases. And then there's the missed school days. When children are sick, they can't go to school, and that further inhibits their development. Some teenage girls can't even go to school on days when they're menstruating, because if their school doesn't have a sanitation facility, there's nowhere where they can go to clean or replace used menstrual hygiene materials. Inadequate sanitation doesn't just affect children, it affects adults as well. When adults get sick, they can't work. And when they can't work, that affects the overall economic productivity of the country and of the local area. And many poor people in developing countries are subsistence farmers, and they live in non-cash-based economies, where if you don't work for one day, you don't eat for one day. You don't work for 2 days, you don't eat for 2 days. Women are especially vulnerable. If a woman has to openly defecate out in public, she's vulnerable to harassment and even sexual assault. That leads me to my last point, the human dignity aspect of it. You might be inclined to believe that in areas where open defecation is common and people use squalid toilets, that they're just used to it. But I can tell you that for most people, they feel just as embarrassed and just as degraded as you or I would be if we had to do the same thing. In 2010, the United Nations and countries around the world declared that basic sanitation is a human right. It's not a luxury, it's not a nice thing to have, it's not a privilege bestowed upon you for being a citizen of a certain country. It's a right that you're entitled to by the virtue of being born, by the virtue of existing. Yet 2.5 billion people are denied this right. Now, upon hearing something like this, some people will think, you know, I understand that people in other countries, they got it bad and they're suffering, but I'm an American. In America, we got our own problems. We got to take care of our own problems first. And sanitation, it's not a problem here. Except that it is. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, more than 1 million Americans lack that basic sanitation. Now, basic sanitation, as the EPA defines it, is different than the global definition I was just talking about. It's a much higher standard. Yet, by our own standards, 1 million Americans don't have basic sanitation. They're frequently very poor. They live in both rural and urban areas, and they're disproportionately represented by Native Americans and Alaskan natives. Then there's what we do with the wastewater after we're done with it. 20 years from now, phosphorus reserves in the United States are going to be almost completely depleted. And a few decades after that, global phosphorus reserves are going to be at emergency levels. Guess what's just loaded with phosphorus? In a few decades, you're going to be excreting a commodity more valuable than oil. With our current sanitation practices, most of that phosphorus, which is contained in urine, by the way, not in feces, is just thrown away. Hardly any of it is recovered. Modern sanitation systems, as we know them today, were developed in the late 1800s, and they've hardly changed since then. Think about how much transportation has changed since the late 1800s. Think about how much communications have changed since the late 1800s. Why is it that the most important medical advance since 1840 has hardly been improved upon? There's a lot of reasons for this, but I'm going to touch on one major one right now, and that's that sanitation suffers from a huge image problem. Sanitation and toilets and poop and pee, these things are disgusting, they're smelly, they're offensive, they belong behind a locked door. You can't get any unsexier than sanitation. And as a result, the general public doesn't want to talk about it. They don't even want to think about it. What I'm going to propose to all of you today is something that you can do to improve the problems that I just talked about. And that's just talk about sanitation. Just think about it. Realize that sanitation has a value equivocal to drinking water and demand better. Sanitation has enormous implications for the use of critical resources here at home, and it can be the difference between life and death for millions of people living abroad. But we can't take steps towards addressing those problems if we're not even talking about it. Now that you've heard my speech, I assume that you're all beginning to think about sanitation a little bit more now. So I'd like to thank all of you for taking this first small step towards better sanitation. Toastmasters.